Good afternoon. I'm Roy Dunbar. Thank you for joining us. Very much appreciate that. As a director, and I know many of you are also in that same position, we've had responsibilities for aligning human capital around many different types of company transactions. It's really very important that the board has a well-defined strategy around the human capital, obviously aligned to the strategy for the transaction, and ensuring that the go-forward team that will be running the company is really the right and the best team. We're going to be exploring this topic today, and with me are two executive compensation experts, Adam Cayley and his colleague, Harry Jablansky. I'm going to turn us over to Marie, who will take us forward.
Thank you, Roy. And we can go ahead and move to the next slide. Welcome, everyone. I just want to welcome you to this webinar, and I want to thank the Perlmeyer team for putting together this informative presentation that's going to help our compensation committee members prepare for future transactions. The topic is sure to drive a ton of questions among you. So please remember to use the Q&A box to submit your questions by clicking Q&A on the button on the right of your screen. We have built a little bit of time towards the end of the presentation to deal with this Q&A, but please note that by submitting your question with your name, you're allowing us to provide Perlmeyer with your email address in the case that we may not be able to get to your question during the allotted time. This also gives them the opportunity to share thought leadership with you in the future. The number one question that we always get, so I'm going to say it right from the get-go, is, are the webinar slides available, and will this webinar be available later? Yes and yes. The slides are currently available under the resources as a PDF, and the webinar will be available next week, both on Perlmeyer and NACD websites. A link will also be available in your post-event email. As always, I'll go to the next slide. Thanks. As always, we offer credits for your attendance as an NACD fellow or a certified director. Please note that you must attend the webinar for at least 50 minutes to receive credit. And speaking of that certification program, if you are not already part of it, we really recommend you learn more, because this is a great way to set yourself apart from other directors as a high performance director, someone who is interested in continuing learning and learning all the new trends and things that come up in your boardroom. If you want more information about that, you can always reach your member advisor or go to credentialing@nacdonline.org. Finally, at the very end, we have a few evaluation questions that we would love for you to fill out. This only helps us improve our webinars in the future, and it really helps us with your feedback. Let us know the topics that you're interested in, as well as how we did today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my friends at Perlmeyer. So Adam, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Excellent. Thanks, Marie. So what we have prepared for you today is a presentation covering transactions, so both IPOs and mergers and acquisitions. But we're going to approach it from two angles. So I work in Perlmeyer's executive compensation practice, so I'm working with compensation committees. So when I'm preparing a company for a transaction, whether it be an IPO or an M&A, I'm thinking about, do we have the right severance protections in place? Do we have the right considerations for equity grants upon an IPO, for example, or do we have the right retention bonuses and incentives in place? My colleague Carrie will be thinking about it from the leadership perspective. So are we preparing and selecting the leaders with the right skill sets? And post-merger, do we have regular coaching and feedback and so on to ensure a successful transition? So often in working with my compensation committees, obviously compensation is the focus. But I think, as we all heard at the NACD Summit Conference, for example, this is a increasing trend that compensation committees are talking about the leadership considerations as well. So we thought it would make sense to be holistic here. So let's move on to the next slide where we have our first polling question. So if you pop open your poll section, this will be available. And what we'd like you to do is select all of the responses for any of the organizations that you work with, whether you're on the board or management on that company. Are you considering any of the following? An initial public offering, a public to private transaction? Are you considering acquiring another company, being acquired, or considering a merger of equals, or lastly, a spin-off, or if none of the apply, go ahead and select that. So it looks like we're getting some good responses in here. Okay. It's looking like most people are considering the acquisition front. Got a few IPOs, few looking to be acquired, few mergers of equals and spin-offs. So I think that's about what we had expected. Pretty good mix there. But what we'll start off today is the whole topic of IPOs. And if we move to the next slide, just before getting into compensation considerations in the context of IPO, I just wanted to give an overview of recent history of what's happened in the IPO market over the past few years. So it's certainly been a bumpy few years in the IPO market. So in 2021, there were actually a record number of IPOs in the US, just over 1,000. And this was fueled by a variety of factors. And those included low interest rates, a general optimism and investor enthusiasm, following the pandemic, and also increased popularity of what's known as SPACs, or special purpose acquisition companies. In fact, of the 1,000 companies that IPO'd in 2021, actually 60% of those were actually those SPACs. So these were effectively blank check companies that merged with private companies, which became a popular avenue for bringing a company to the public market. Now in 2021, there was a downturn in the market in IPOs. It was driven by, again, a number of factors: higher inflation, rising interest rates, risk aversion in general among investors. And these SPACs actually saw an increased amount of regulatory scrutiny starting in that year. And as market conditions started to deteriorate, investors became less inclined to invest in speculative assets like SPACs. Also, in terms of performance, many SPACs, once they merged with a target company, saw their stock prices decline, which started to contribute to a general level of skepticism on this SPAC model as a whole. Now, in 2023, these factors continued to impact the IPO market, resulting in a further reduction to the number of IPOs. In addition, the growth of private equity firms and the availability of private capital gave companies alternatives to going public. Now, in 2024, we saw a bit of a resurgence. It was driven by improved economic conditions overall, a rebound in global equity markets, heightened enthusiasm from investors and companies. And particular sectors that saw an uptick in IPOs were tech and healthcare. And private equity and venture capital-backed IPOs also contributed to this. The industries of artificial intelligence and fintech attracted interest. And then once the election was completed, there's a bit more clarity on the kind of policy front, which kind of further boosted the market at the end of 2024. Now, as of the first quarter of 2025, we actually saw a pretty good increase, 74% over the same quarter last year. And overall, from the experts that follow IPOs, they're estimating, at least at the beginning of the year, they were estimating a total number of IPOs in the range of 150 to 190 overall. So that's excluding SPACs. However, given the recent volatility, the impact of tariffs, this may put a damper on the IPO market. But the good news is, as of April 2022 here, in terms of IPO filings, we have 72 new IPOs that have been filed. That's up a third over the prior year. To the extent that these aren't significantly delayed, we should see pretty good activity in IPOs in this year. Okay. So next slide these are the key considerations that we think about. And there was an article that was linked in this session that has more details on all this. So I'll just kind of touch on the main points here. So number one, when preparing for an IPO, you want to start early. You want to start at least 12 months in front of the IPO, ideally 18 months if you've got the time. And you want to assemble the right cross-functional team. So this is often driven by, obviously you want the executive team involved, you want the CEO, CFO. Chief HR officer often is the one driving this key initiative and assembling these cross-functional teams. We obviously want finance, accounting, legal, IT, and you'll be working with outside legal counsel who will be drafting the registration statement, all the equity incentive plan agreements and everything that go along with that. And obviously, compensation leadership advisors as needed. In terms of your compensation philosophy, it's a good time to revisit that. In some upcoming slides here, we'll talk about how compensation philosophy and models and pay mix models shift over time once you shift from a private company to a public company. So that should be a key consideration. In terms of peer groups, so most boards, most compensation committees establish an industry-specific peer group that they use to benchmark executive and board of directors compensation. In the context of an IPO, what we typically do is develop an additional peer set that is comprised of companies that IPO'd within recent history. And given the kind of volatility you've seen in the number of IPOs in the past few years, we typically go back to 2022, sometimes 2021 to pick up more examples. So we develop an IPO specific peer group. It can be broader in terms of industry sector, as long as it's within a reasonable range of market cap at IPO that's comparable to your company. That peer set is used to benchmark IPO specific practices. And this entails setting up your initial equity incentive plan. In particular, what is that initial equity pool that you will provide for grants at IPO and going forward? And then on the broader employee front, do you establish an employee stock purchase plan? That peer group can also be used to determine what is the right level of equity to provide right at IPO. Is there a rationale to provide an additional at IPO grant? And that peer group will give you some market context to evaluate if it's necessary and how much and in what form. Beyond that, it's about reevaluating your market pay levels, your annual and long-term incentive plan design, making sure you've got the right employment contracts in place, whether they be individual agreements, severance plans, change control, et cetera. Setting up a board of directors comp plan as a first time for the as a publicly traded company. And then obviously establishing a compensation committee, drafting the necessary compensation committee charter, all the necessary disclosures and so on. The last piece is your practices will evolve over time. As you move from a privately held company to publicly traded, there may be some practices that you do upon IPO or in the first couple of years that you might want to transition to something that is more representative of a mature public company over time. Next slide, please. So I mentioned we have some information here that shows you how compensation philosophy and pay mix changes from a privately held company to a publicly traded. And in general, for startup companies, for private equity backed, venture capital backed companies, you typically see a more conservative positioning on the cash, so on the base and the bonus, and a more aggressive positioning on equity. And the reason for joining a startup is obviously the equity stake, the potential for growth there. Most companies in that environment are evaluating equity from a percentage of company basis. They're looking at a one-time grant upon joining the company or periodic refresh grants when there's a new funding round, when the dilution has been shifted and so on. As you become more late stage, as you're ready to go public or consider going public, you may see a transition away from that equity heavy model, a transition away from one-time or ad hoc grants, and a shift to annual equity grants and preparing to become a publicly traded company. And then once you become public, for companies that emerge or go public as emerging growth, obviously subject to reduced number of regulations and disclosure requirements. So that impacts whether you're going to IPO as an emerging growth or a mature public company outside of the emerging growth status. This impacts how you'll structure compensation and the regulatory items that you've got to be concerned with. Okay. Now on the next slide, we've prepared, we've taken all these things that we've just talked about, and we've put them together in an overall timeline in an ideal scenario, how you'd want to prepare for an IPO. So in this particular instance, you've got a company that is preparing to IPO in Q2 of 2025. And leading up to that, the Q3 of the year prior, 2024, is when you want to be putting all those fundamental analyses in place. You want to set that peer group. You want to benchmark compensation levels as well as equity levels. And you want to use these peer groups to design the provisions in your equity incentive plan, your employee stock purchase plan, and so on. The quarter before the IPO is when you're applying that information and applying that benchmarking to develop go-forward pay structures for the executive team and the broader management team, putting together recommendations for the go-forward equity plan design in terms of the type of equity that you'll grant, whether you're going to consider using performance shares or not within the first year. And then lastly, a key consideration is there a need for an additional equity grant at IPO? And in the companies that I've worked with in preparing them to go public, this is often one of the most meaty areas, one of the areas that involves the most discussion and the most analysis, because in order to determine if an additional equity grant outside of the normal annual grant practice is necessary at IPO, we want to understand what is the level of ownership of each of the executives upon the IPO. Do they have sufficient holding power in the equity that they currently hold going forward? And then lastly, for recent IPO practices, what level of ownership have those executives had upon the IPO? How does it benchmark to the market? And how does it benchmark to your industry peer set? So then once you've successfully completed the IPO, then you're transitioning to a normal compensation committee calendar, where on an annual basis, you're reevaluating that peer set, you're benchmarking pay practices, you're reevaluating the incentive plan design in each year. Okay. Roy, was there anything that you wanted to share from your experience on IPOs and key things to be aware of as you're thinking about the timeline?
Perhaps just one quick thing. The compensation that the compensation committee is usually concerned with are for the C-suite and maybe the next level down. But for IPO, it is critical that the employees in general understand how the company makes money and how the shareholders value the company. So this alignment all the way down through management ranks as to the levers of value creation are crucial. So clearly incentivize the top tier, but also ensure that each level of management understand the core economics of the company. I think that's what made the MasterCard IPO in 2006 really one of the most successful. I was part of that, one of the most successful of that decade.
Thanks, Roy. So on the next slide, we've got information on particular considerations for companies that have PE ownership, are going public, and that private equity firm will maintain a big ownership stake, and essentially that will be a publicly traded portfolio company. In addition to all the other considerations we just mentioned, we have to consider what is that private equity firm's philosophy and strategy, and how do we incorporate that when we're thinking about the incentive plan design and what's important in terms of value creation. So there's a lot on the slide. I won't dive into details because I want to make sure we move on to the next section on M&As. Okay, so in terms of mergers and acquisitions, when we're thinking about compensation and how we plan for an M&A, we typically think of this in these three main buckets. So there's change control planning, kind of general pre-merger planning, and then post-merger integration. A lot of the change and control planning is really tax planning. It's evaluating the severance protections, the change control protections that are in place, and understanding, really doing the due diligence to understand if we're going to acquire this company, what will be the sum total of the severance payments, the accelerated equity payments. Do we anticipate that there will be any excise tax liabilities that executives will have, or will we have any lost tax deductions and so on? And really thinking about the fact that this information, if we're doing a publicly traded company acquiring a company, we'll need to be ready to disclose all that information. So you want to bring in the appropriate legal and tax experts to really wrap your hands around that and really do the due diligence. In terms of pre-merger planning, this goes beyond kind of what's existing in place, but is there a need to provide for any enhanced severance protections? Do we need to consider any special transaction bonuses or retention bonuses? Do we need to take a fresh look at the employment contracts? And this 280G golden parachute analysis, that's kind of aligned with what I was talking about with change control. You want to understand what will be triggered potentially under the severance and change control agreements. Lastly, what's really important is the post-merger integration. So you want to evaluate programs for both organizations and understand really how do we transition to one structure over time, or do we, for example, let the acquired company maintain their existing structure and do a slow transition over time? Really, what's the right strategy? What's the right time frame and planning of all that? So Roy, based on your experience, what are some key considerations to think about in planning for an M&A as well?
Yeah, so perhaps two come to mind. The first relates to the uncertainty broadly around M&A, especially when regulatory approval is required. It may be domestic, it may be international. There is uncertainty, and that timeline you may plan for a year, it may extend, it may even break. One may even get a break of the merger agreement. And so it is important to plan for a reasonable best case. It's also important to plan for a failed case, because in that instance, you want to be sure you can retain talent. You want to be sure there are incentives enough that your top executives don't get tired, don't get poached. So those are factors to bearing in mind for the outcome that is undesirable and to plan for that. The other thing that I would flag up are mergers of equals, which frankly the term is there, but I'm not sure that in practice there is ever a merger of equals. You can get, even after the merger agreement is struck, a lot of social issues that create dysfunctionality. And the company that may succeed, it may bear the name of the joint, the CEO that may be ultimately the successor CEO, all of those things, not only in terms of compensation, but in the potential severance to individuals who might think, I'll succeed this CEO when that person is, made executive chair or whatever it is. Those factors, especially the downside, the things not going right, are really very important, right down to the boards, because you may get directors from both companies who ultimately succeed to be the directors of the new company, and there may be some dysfunction on the social level. My point here is plan not just for the success that you anticipate, but ensure you've got contingencies when things may not work out. Back to you, Adam.
Absolutely, a lot of risk management going on there for sure. Okay, we've got another polling question related to transactions, and in particular, during an M&A, often companies consider a special transaction bonus. So whether it's delivered in cash or equity, or some companies will think about enhancing their severance or change control agreements. So for all of you that are anticipating a possible transaction in 2025, are you consider any of the following? So please check all that apply here. Great. So it's looking like most people, or about 2/3, are doing something, considering doing something, with about half of you considering some sort of transaction bonus, whether it be cash or equity, pretty evenly split between cash or equity, and about a quarter considering enhancing severance or change of control agreements. So I think, yeah, with the organizations we work with, it's usually a combination of those factors that we're looking at, and we want to look at them all together. So on the next slide, as you think about these transaction bonuses, there are two types that we typically see. The first is what's called a deal support bonus, and the second is called a value sharing award. In terms of the distinction here, one of the key differences is a deal support bonus is often defined in cash. It's usually defined in a dollar amount or percentage of base salary. It's typically provided once a particular milestone has been achieved. And it's usually for like a deal team, for the people that are really involved and contributed to a successful transaction. It's typically a fairly broad group. Value sharing awards are mostly aligned to the senior executive team, rather than being thought of as a flat dollar amount or as a percentage of base salary. They're often thought of in terms of share in the value creation here. So they're often defined as a percentage of the total deal value where a pool is established for that senior management team, or it could be established in terms of a fixed number of shares. So really the thought process here is sharing in the value creation that led to a successful transaction. Now, vesting and payment of this most often occur at close, with a possible acceleration if there's like a qualifying termination, like a resignation, termination for cause or resignation for good reason. On the next slide are some of the key considerations that you want to think about when you're designing this. You want to think about who are we going to have eligible, who's really critical to the success of the transaction, who has additional workload because of the transaction. You want to think about really the integration period after the transaction, how many payments we'll have, where there will just be one at transaction, or it's one 6 months later, another 12 months later. It all really kind of depends on the situation, how long the transition, the integration after the acquisition is expected to last. So just got a few more slides here. We've got some key data on the next slide from a survey that we just sent out, where we asked people, for those of you who have completed a transaction in terms of an M&A in the past, recent history, how have you designed it? So this first one gets to eligibility. So this just shows for those that had a retention or transaction bonus, who was eligible. And interestingly here, you'll see the CEO was about a third of CEOs, but most of the retention incentives here were provided to other C-suite and other kind of key employees critical to the success of the transaction. So this just goes to show you, you may not have to always consider the senior most executive team if they have existing severance in place, if they have existing equity that's going to provide a significant amount of hook to them. You might look more broadly within the team. And the chart on the right just shows for retention bonuses what an average retention bonus amount was as a percentage of base salary. This kind of varies by level, but typically you see for CEO it's in the range of 100 to 150% of base salary. Other C-suite in the 120% range, and other employees critical to success in like the 30 to 50% range. In terms of the retention period, it really depends on the intent and whether you want someone to stay through the transaction event, through the full integration, or to incent them to stay for a significant period of time, 2 to 3 years after the integration. So Roy, based on your experience with how these have worked, what have you seen as the most kind of successful in terms of the timeline here and how the payments are made over time?
I think the timeline, I won't have a comment, and I should also just say that we may need to move a little faster overall. But before I turn it back to you, I like payments that are made in equity. because they incentivize alignment with the shareholder, and you really want executives to be around until that IPO, but more particular merger acquisition really delivers value. That is what I get excited about, because I know the investor would be excited about it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're right at the point to transition to Carrie, but before I do so, the next few slides here just provide a little more information on how timing of payments typically work for this. Slide 19, we have some data from that survey as well in terms of how these deal transaction bonuses were structured and the total amount as a percentage of deal value. One thing I'll note is when you are looking to structure this sort of transaction bonus, in addition to thinking about what's the right amount from an internal perspective, there's a lot of data out there disclosed on recent transactions. So if you're contemplating one, I would say work with an advisor that can provide you with data of recent transactions that have been made within a range of deal values that you're considering, and that could be used as really market data to align with what you're trying to do for your company. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Carrie, who will talk about leadership considerations in M&As.
Everyone, great to be with you today. I'm Carrie Jablonski. I'm Managing Director at Blake Street Group, which is a Pearl Meyer consulting practice, and I also lead our leadership advisory practice. So for the last 15 years, we've been focused on driving ROI in deal contexts, working both with publicly traded companies as well as private equity firms and their portfolio companies. And for this second section today, we will focus on how to drive value in deal contexts using our various tools in our leadership toolkit. So Adam walked us through IPO trends in the past couple of years. So how do M&A trends more broadly compare? It's no surprise that M&A is down in 2025. I think that the most recent data that I've seen cites anywhere between 13% and mid-20s in terms of how much we're down in the first quarter, including relating to the trade woes. However, we are empirically still seeing some optimism in the market regarding liquidity, and with both as to sponsors and strategics, as well as a desire to put cash to work. And so we'll have to just all wait and see how the rest of the year shakes out. It's of course hard to predict at this point. So with this as a backdrop, from Adam's section, we know how important it is to align compensation matters to business goals. And we do the very same thing on the leadership side of the house. And in doing so, can draw from the various tools that we're going to talk about today to really maximize both business performance as well as ROI. These tools apply across a variety of deals that Adam had talked about, I think, in the first polling question. So we customize them, whether we're in a merger of equal context, whether we're going private to public, whether we're going public to private, whether we are in an add-on acquisition context, or whether we're in a deal context without any meaningful integration, and a variety of other contexts as well. So the point on this slide in front of you, number 20, before we move on, is really just that undergoing formal talent work as part of your deal context is becoming best practice and meaningfully drives outcomes. Let's go to our next slide, which is another polling question for you as we kick off this section. So the question is this: where there is not focus on human capital in an M&A context, many deals fail to achieve their financial and strategic promise. So which of the following have you seen in your experience, again, and check all that apply, following derailers have you encountered from a recent transaction? So have you encountered unwanted turnover of stronger performers? Or have you seen a failure to move quickly on talent. So meaning having that talent action plan within the first 100 days and ensuring that the right people are in the right seats with new defined role priorities. Have you seen culture clashes between the existing culture and the new one? Unclear integration process and priorities, or something else? Okay, we have a variety of responses in. And it seems like we have a decently equal distribution among the first four, but the majority of respondents are saying that the biggest derailer that you're seeing is around culture clashes, which can also lead to impeding collaboration, of course, between the cultures that are coming together, as well as demotivating employees. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So we'll frame our leadership considerations today in 4 areas in the following order. So we'll talk about pre-close talent considerations, and you'll see that on the left-hand side of this slide. We'll then talk about post-close talent considerations. And there are a number of reasons that we distinguish these, but the distinction is very important. And one of the reasons for that is that pre-close data that we're able to get is very different than post-close data. And it must be analyzed differently and kind of from where the data comes, and we can use it in different ways. Third, we're going to talk about kind of CEO succession-related considerations which span both pre-close and post-close contexts. And finally, we'll end, if we have time, with some considerations on the talent front with regards to IPO context specifically. So first off, pre-close considerations. What are we focused on in a pre-close human capital diligence process? There are a couple of questions that we see that arise time and time again. Number one is, what is the lift needed between the current talent and the emerging post-close business strategy? And we can get at this in a pre-close customized diligence process. Number two, in terms of a consideration or question that we are frequently trying to answer, what is the openness to change? So then you can see, you can almost imagine a 2x2 where you have a high degree of lift needed, a high degree of change needed to execute on the go-forward value creation plan. But openness to change among leadership is very low. So that is going to drive a lot of different considerations in your deal negotiations, for example. Thirdly, we're uncovering what are all the key individual talent related and team related and culture related risks that may arise from this deal. So we want to get that data early, and we can talk about all the different ways in which we use that data in a moment. And then finally, boards are coming to us and asking, okay, we want additional data in these specific targeted areas. And so we do target that pre-close diligence around those areas. So on the post-close side, we're focused then on 2 things: top team formation, so actually bringing the team together. What is the new go-forward team? And then when we have the team, top team effectiveness. How do we get that team working together? So with a very high degree of predictability, we know from our data and from our toolkits that we are going to be able to successfully execute on the go-forward strategy. So we'll come back to the post-close more in a bit, but let's go to the next slide and stay focused on the pre-close context for a little bit longer. There are 3 process steps at a 10,000 foot level that we go through in a pre-close human capital due diligence context. First is we really do need to ground in what those go-forward company goals are: 1 year and 3 to 5 years. And this is critical because talent assessment and development in our rich experience cannot be done absent goals. It must be very tightly interwoven with what the company goals are. And then we cascade that down to individual C-suite goals. Second of all, then we're conducting a bespoke talent and organizational diligence focused on the CEO and C-suite. Typically, we are getting access to anywhere between 3 and 8 leaders in a pre-close diligence process. And depending on access, we're spending anywhere between 2 and let's say 4 hours with individual leaders around the key questions and considerations that we talked about on the earlier slide. When we get that data and analyze that data in the context of the go-forward company goals, we're able to pinpoint where are we well positioned. In other words, what are the value creation drivers, and where are we not well positioned, and what do we need to do about that? That data is typically, in our experience, used in a pre-close context in a variety of ways, including the ones listed under number 3 here. So first of all, the most obvious, the go, no-go decision on the deal. So a lot of times this data does ultimately impact whether we move forward with a deal. Second of all, price negotiations. In a recent deal we worked on, there was a $100 million shift in the price based on the human capital due diligence data alone. Third, and this is maybe even the most important one on this list, the data that we can collect in the human capital due diligence process is typically leading to really important discussions, alignment discussions with key leaders on retention matters, on timeline matters, and really importantly, on shaping swim lanes and definition around go-forward roles. And it's often important that that these alignment conversations occur in the pre-close time period in order to maximize post-close success. In addition, this data pretty typically helps shape integration planning, including the culture work that needs to be done, as well as builds alignment among key constituents more broadly when we have, especially a merger of equals and in a merger of equal context. Roy, let me turn this over to you and ask, where are you most typically focused in a pre-close diligence process when it comes to leadership considerations?
Yes, I'll be brief, carriers with the press for time, but it really is around the people, the talent relative to the go-forward strategy, and the cultural fit. Those are the areas that are absolutely crucial, and we know they're absolutely crucial because when we reflect on why these things fail to deliver the expected value, it comes back to people, talent, culture, and the speed of moving all of that along.
Yes, great, absolutely. Okay, let's move to the next slide in the interest of time. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the post-close considerations. So we really view post-close from a leadership or talent perspective in 3 phases. First is the diagnostic, and all of this really is to maximize, maximizing ROI and M&A requires this clear data-driven diagnostic and resulting talent action plan, and we get that in phase 1, which is what we call the organizational review. So here we're typically now meeting with somewhere between 8 and 20 leaders, and for a couple of hours each, again, grounded in business goals, but by this time, business goals are usually even more crystallized. And now we're getting post-close data, which is much more valuable than pre-close data when it comes to truly mapping out what the go-forward human capital plan needs to be. It's just a completely different animal. You can ask the same questions, but you get different data, and you can calibrate it in different ways. So from the organizational review, we do have the customized kind of prioritized talent action plan, which says, starting at the top of the house, where, what leaders need to be in what roles with what priorities, and putting the puzzle pieces together, if you will, as compared to business goals to get this thing to hum with a very high degree of predictability. So that's kind of phase 1. Phase 2 now moves into, we need to actually create this new team. We need to execute on the talent action plan. And so we do that in a number of ways. We need to do deep dive assessments of incoming talent where new skills are needed. We need to move quickly on underperformers. This is one of the biggest derailers in this kind of context, which is holding on to underperformers where we know that the individual can't scale or doesn't have the right skill set in the new post-close context. Number 3, we need to modify roles to best play to strengths, and we know what the strengths are with scientific precision from the diagnostic. And number 4, we need to really think about how best to scaffold different leaders and or de-risk their key risks or best support their development areas to get the most out of our key value creation drivers. Key drivers of talent on the talent side. So that's phase 2. Then now we have our new team, and our new team has come together. We know we have the right people in the right seats with the right top 3 role priorities each. Now, how do we get the team to coalesce? This is when we move into our top team effectiveness work. This is around establishing the right culture. This is around establishing the right executive team norms and modes of operating. And this is where we can then turn to leadership team development, not just at an individual level, but also as a team as a whole. So let's move on to our next slide, which dives into the notion and the tools that we have on the leadership development side a little bit more specifically. So there are proven ways to accelerate performance, both at an individual level and across an ELT through customized leadership development. And in assessing talent, we know that by far, the best predictor of future behavior in terms of how somebody is going to show up in a particular role is past behavior. However, we also know that we can successfully develop leaders when certain conditions are present to perform even better than they have in the past. And this is where we utilize our leadership development and executive coaching toolkits. In our experience, executive coaching, like the other work, can't be done in the abstract. It must be done in the context of the business goals and of the role-specific goals, and with 1 or 2 clear targets per 6-month time period in order to be effective. Some examples of where we focus on the executive coaching front, including and specifically in deal context, are as follows. So we're oftentimes dealing with leaders that we're now asking, so promising leaders, but we're now asking them to operate at a much larger scale or with a much bigger team, or where they're just first time in role. This is a right context for the right executive coaching support. And we can, there's a lot more to this for another time. Secondly, another common theme for where we utilize executive coaching in a deal context is really around inspiring and motivating others to drive the change management that's needed, including in bringing cultures together, but also in a transformation context where all the other change that we know needs to occur, whether it's cost cutting or otherwise. In addition to building skills, we're also focused on driving behavioral change. So this could take the form of de-risking someone's derailers. It could take the form of cultivating a growth mindset, drawing upon Carol Dweck's amazing work and her research. And the growth mindset is something that we're particularly focused on when somebody's in a new role and we need to help expand their runway, if you will. And then particularly more recently, there's been a higher demand for what we call executive flourishing. So how do we successfully manage the high degree of stress that comes along with a lot of this change management and deal context? And there's kind of specific things that we do to help senior executives manage this proactively and successfully drive the management, and bringing cultures and teams together.
Yeah.
We also right, please go ahead.
Carrie, I have a question, and then the question will also help you to wrap up a lot of your prepared comments to go into Q&A. The question relates to talent scaffold. Can you expand on that statement, please?
Yes, great question. So when we have promising talent, but the talent is a balanced ledger, like we all are, meaning has a lot of great strengths, but also a lot of important development areas or risk areas. So we want to best position that individual to leverage and play to their strengths, but we need to de-risk their risk areas. And oftentimes what that means is scaffolding, providing scaffolding around them. So maybe if there's a key aspect of the area of the role that they cannot perform, providing them help, or somebody underneath them is a direct report that has that skill set, or changing their role around to better play to their strengths, or providing, taking an aspect of their role and giving it to a peer, or providing them with other mentorship or support, whatever the case by case basis may be, in terms of helping ensure their success given their specific role priorities.
Thank you. And perhaps to wrap up your key messages so nothing is lost, and then we'll continue the Q&A.
Excellent. So I think, we've talked about pre-close and post-close considerations, which really are the most important. We also must keep in mind CEO succession considerations across. And I do think this is a good stopping point. Let's turn it over, Roy, to you to moderate and hear what questions our audience has.
Okay, thank you so much. That was excellent. And Adam, back to you on the, I think it was you that shared the IPO checklist. How important is that checklist, even if the intent is for the company to be acquired? And perhaps just a comment from my past experience, which is sometimes you want to preserve optionality. So you may actually do a dual track, but please give your thoughts.
So for an IPO, some key considerations are developing to talk about scaffolding, we're developing the scaffolding of being a new publicly traded company as a separate entity. So designing the equity incentive plan, thinking about key awards at IPO, and so on. When we're talking about the context of being acquired, I think the focus is less on those kind of scaffolding as a publicly traded company, but making sure that you're providing the incentives to have the management team and those key to success ensure a successful transaction if the goal is to be acquired by another company. So that may entail ensuring you've got the right employment protections, severance and change control protections in place. It may entail these considerations for a separate transaction or retention bonus. So it's really ensuring we've got the scaffolding from a employment security perspective and incentives perspective to ensure that that team is motivated to do that transaction successfully, and that they feel that they've got the protections in place to be part of that company going forward if that's the plan.
Right. So then what do you do in the case that a deal does not close and some form of bonus was on the books for that deal?
So typically for these transaction bonuses, if a transaction is not realized, it is usually not paid, because the company may going forward consider other transactions. However, I have seen cases where a committee wants to recognize the efforts of the management team or those involved that led up to that transaction, even though it wasn't successful, through some sort of discretionary bonus or spot bonus that recognizes their efforts. But I think you always have to consider as well, the goal going forward will also be to pursue other acquisitions or whatever the strategy is. So there will be something down the road, but I think once in a while you do see some more discretionary payments provided in those instances.
Very good, because you have a retention risk then, which you've got to solve for. Thank you. So Carrie, to you with a question related to coaching. Nowadays, many organizations, executives have coaches. As you're moving towards an acquisition or an IPO, what recommendation do you have? Is the questioner is asking, should the in-house coaching or the pre-existing coaching continue, or should you maybe identify specific transaction coaches?
Yeah, great question as well. So you could have first need a diagnostics to say, okay, what are going to be the new skills that are going to be needed in the public company context as compared to the current context? and then some sort of calibration on how much of a change that's going to be. Then you want to take a look at, does the coach have the ability and the proven track record, him or herself, to drive that change, that shift in that context. So you have to weigh what's probably a very nice historical relationship with the coach with, okay, can the coach then take you to the next level? We see, this is non-scientific, but maybe about half the time somebody stays with their existing coach but shifts to a new area of focus, and maybe about half the time it's time to look for a new coach with different skill sets to get you through the IPO process and beyond.
Thank you. So perhaps both of you would chime in here for this question, which relates to the timing of creation of transaction bonuses, and at what point thereafter would you communicate it to the relevant employees?
So I think we had a slide in there that kind of showed the overall timeline. And I think, first of all, you're a separate entity, and then at some point there's going to be announcement of intent that we're going to, pursue an acquisition, right? Shortly after that announcement of an intent is made, I think is the point at which you're going to want to put in place a plan, or your intent to put in place a transaction or retention bonus plan, because there's quickly going to be a team assembled to do the due diligence, the planning, and the communication, and so on. And you want to make sure that's, available quickly after that communication is made. And then ultimately, in terms of the payment schedule, usually there's a payment provided at the event, or 6 months to 12 months after, sometimes longer. But you want to be ready with that incentive plan in place shortly after the communication is announced.
Very good. Adam, thank you so much. Well, I think we've got to the end of the presentation and the Q&A. I'd like now to turn it back to Mary to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Adam and Carrie, for your expertise. Roy, for your point of view and your experience. I know I saw a couple of notes in the chat that people really appreciated you sharing your experience as well. While we ran out of time, there were so many good questions that came in through the Q&A that I know that our team at Perlmeyer is going to be responding to you via email. But I just wanted to have a quick few reminders for you before we conclude the program. If we can go to the next slide, I want you to remind you guys that this is one in a series of webinars. Our next webinar in the compensation series will be in July. You can go to our website and learn more on our webinars page. And if you missed out on our previous webinars, you can also visit our archives at nacdonline.org/webinars or on Perlmeyer's site as well. Finally, before you go, I'd like to remind you to please fill out that evaluation form in the Attendee Hub, or it's in the link that comes in following up in the follow-up email. As I mentioned, it helps us by you providing feedback that not only helps us improve this webinar series, but all of our webinars. I did see a couple of questions about polling and the inability to be able to answer on time. Please note that that will not affect your ability to have an ACD credits, so do not worry about that. We noticed that a couple of folks did not have a chance to answer in time. This concludes our program, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you again in July or on another NACD webinar, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.